Hello everyone, welcome back to Ancient Greece and Rome. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the most important ancient Near Eastern civilizations. And these civilizations would have had at least some contact with the Greeks. Others, like the Persians, would have had a lot of contact with the Greeks. The Persians, of course, fought wars against the Greek city-states in the Persian Wars. And then the Persian Empire is ultimately going to be destroyed by Alexander the Great and the Greeks. We'll begin the video, though, by talking about the Babylonian civilization. We'll talk about early Babylonia, around the time of Hammurabi, and then we'll talk about the Neo-Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar. And we'll talk about some of the connections between the Babylonians and the Greeks. We'll also talk about the Assyrian civilization, a very militaristic civilization in the ancient Near East. They're known for their cities and their warfare and their military technologies. And the Greeks certainly would have been aware of the Assyrian civilization. Some of the other smaller Near Eastern civilizations, small but not insignificant civilizations, are the Phoenicians, who developed the first true alphabet, the Hebrews, also known as the Israelites, and the Hittites. We'll talk about those three civilizations briefly, and then we'll finish this video by talking about the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. We'll talk about the origins of the Persian Empire, their architecture and their artifacts, and we'll talk about their relations with the Greeks. Let's start with the Babylonian civilization. The Babylonian civilization proper lasted from about 1895 BCE to about 539 BCE. The Babylonian Empire emerged in southern Mesopotamia out of the ashes of the old Akkadian Empire, which we talked about in a previous video. The Babylonians spoke a similar language to the Akkadians, and they used the cuneiform writing system as well. The Babylonians also had similar architectural traditions, especially when it came to the construction of ziggurats. But the Babylonians included additional experimentation and advancement in their construction, which we'll talk about later. There are two distinct periods of major influence and cultural hegemony by the Babylonians. The early period, from about 1895 to about 1595 BCE, and the Neo-Babylonian, also known as the Chaldean period, from about 620 to 539 BCE, at which point the civilization lost its independence. Between these two periods, the Babylonian Empire existed, but it was less influential. It was divided by civil wars, or it was under foreign occupation from other empires, like the Hittites or the Assyrians. This period between the early Babylonians and the Neo-Babylonians was somewhat like the intermediate periods the ancient Egyptian civilization experienced. We talked about these intermediate periods in a previous video. Here is the heart of the Babylonian civilization on a map. As you can see, the center of the Babylonian civilization was in southern Mesopotamia, near where the old Akkadian Empire was. Here's Uruk and Ur, discussed previously. Babylon is here, a little bit to the north, between the Euphrates and the Tigris. This is now modern-day Iraq. And now we'll talk about what is perhaps the most enduring contribution of the early Babylonian civilization, Hammurabi's Code of Laws. The early Babylonian civilization's most important leader, Hammurabi, was the sixth king of the first dynasty. As king, Hammurabi produced over 280 laws, which were codified between 1755 and 1750 BCE. Hammurabi's laws were recorded in Akkadian cuneiform on a stele that would be placed in public where all literate people would be able to read it. The stele shown on this slide was about 7.5 feet tall and 2 feet wide. At the top of the stele, there is an image of King Hammurabi receiving the law code from the god Shamash, the Babylonian god of the sun and of justice. This divine image would have legitimized not only Hammurabi's rule, but his law code as well, in the eyes of his subjects. Many of Hammurabi's laws will seem barbaric to us today. For example, punishments like mutilation as a penalty for theft, and liberal use of capital punishment as a penalty for a variety of crimes. But Hammurabi's standardized code of laws, a legal system that everyone could know and understand, was a massive political and cultural development for the time. The law was no longer a mystery. People had a code by which they could live their lives and do business. It's also worth noting that Hammurabi's code contained a presumption of innocence, meaning that an accused person, a defendant, would be treated as innocent until proven guilty, just like the modern American legal code. Another accomplishment of Hammurabi's law code. Hammurabi's law code would have inspired other ancient legal codes, including the Mosaic Law, which is described in the Old Testament, or the Torah. The Jewish books of the law. Here are some close-ups of the stele that contains Hammurabi's code. Here we can see Hammurabi receiving the law code from Shamash, the Babylonian god of justice. He's also considered to be a god of the sun as well. Here is an image of the excavation of the stele before it was moved to the Louvre in Paris. Here is a close-up of the cuneiform writing system on which the code was recorded. Now we'll look at a few more examples of Babylonian art from the early period. The Babylonians during this period and throughout their history generally preferred carved reliefs, unlike the ancient Egyptians who preferred to either make statues or two-dimensional artwork, as we saw in a previous video. The ancient Egyptians made carved reliefs as well, but they tended to be inset, unlike the Babylonian reliefs, where the figures are meant to stand out and project out from the stone, as you can see on this slide here. Religious scenes are common in Babylonian reliefs. The reliefs would have originally been painted, but most of the paint has been faded since these reliefs were outdoors. This slide shows what some of these reliefs would have looked like after they had been made. These reliefs display some combination of animal and human features on their subjects. But the Babylonians preferred to portray their deities, their gods and goddesses, with human heads, animal limbs, and body parts, unlike the Egyptians, who preferred to show their gods and goddesses with animal heads but human bodies. Let's look a little bit more closely at this image here. It's of the Queen of Night, also known as the Burney relief. It's believed to be of Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of sex and warfare, who evolved from the Sumerian deity Inanna that we discussed previously. As you can see, there's a bit of a likeness between the face of the Queen of Night, presumably Ishtar, and the goddess Inanna, whose mask we viewed in a previous lecture. Now we can talk a little bit more about the Babylonian religion and their pantheon of deities. Like the Egyptians and so many other ancient civilizations, the Babylonians were polytheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods. Here are a few examples of some of the gods they worshipped. They worshipped a god of the sky. They worshipped gods of the sun and gods of the land. They also had gods for fire as well. This diagram on the right-hand side compares some of the Babylonian deities to the deities of the Greeks and the Romans, suggesting that Babylonian religious beliefs may have spread westward to the civilizations of Greece and eventually to Rome. Although both the Babylonians and the Egyptians were polytheistic, the Babylonian religion was much more cynical and nihilistic than that of the Egyptians. The Babylonian gods and goddesses were portrayed as being much more capricious and unpredictable, even mercurial. Humans could not always know what the gods were doing, and they could not trust the gods either. Perhaps the best example of the capriciousness of the Babylonian gods and goddesses and the overall nihilism of Babylonian spirituality can be seen in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that we discussed briefly in a previous lecture that may have been based on the exploits of the Akkadian ruler Sargon the Great. Here's a brief recap of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk. He is said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 man. Although he is mostly god and only part man, the other gods do not trust Gilgamesh. They find him to be dangerous, and they are afraid of his power. As a result, one of the gods, named Enki, creates a bull/man hybrid called Enkidu, shown here, who is supposed to fight Gilgamesh and keep him busy so that he cannot threaten the gods. Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight, but instead of becoming enemies, they become friends. And as friends, they kill the bull of heaven, the property of the gods. Gilgamesh also turns down the advances of Ishtar, the goddess of love, sex, and warfare, further alienating Gilgamesh from the gods. The gods decide that Gilgamesh is even more dangerous with Enkidu, so they cause Enkidu to die. Enkidu's death gives Gilgamesh a glimpse of mortality and sends him out on a mission to discover a path to eternal life. He meets a man named Utnapishtim who survived a global flood. Utnapishtim is a Noah-like figure. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that he must eat a magical plant, which Gilgamesh finds, but then the plant is stolen by a snake. In the end, Gilgamesh must be content, knowing that he too will die like his friend Enkidu. As you can see, it's a story that doesn't have a very happy ending. It's about death and the loss of a friend, and recognizing one's own mortality. In a way, it fits very well with the beliefs the Babylonians had about their gods, that their gods and goddesses were not to be trusted, and that they really didn't care very much about humans. Archaeologists and scholars debate why the Babylonians and the Egyptians may have had such different ideas about gods and goddesses. Some postulate that the Babylonians mistrusted their gods because they lived in a more volatile part of the world, namely when it came to flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded far more unpredictably than the floods of the Nile River, which flooded seasonally. Whereas flooding was a blessing to the ancient Egyptians, it could be a curse to the ancient Babylonians, which may be why they viewed their gods differently. Now we'll talk a little bit about Babylonian monumental architecture, namely their ziggurats. The example we're using here is from Ur, a city that's much older than the Babylonians, but became very important to the Babylonian civilization. Remember, the peoples of Mesopotamia tended to use a lot more mud bricks in their construction than other civilizations, meaning that even their greatest, most impressive buildings would break down with time, leaving behind tells, like you can see here. On top of these tells, ziggurats would be built, but even the ziggurats would break down and have to be reconstructed, as you can see here in this modern reconstruction, or in this artist's rendition of what a ziggurat may have looked like. Now let's talk about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Neo-Babylonian Empire lasted from about 620 to 539 BCE. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was known for its monumental architecture and military conquests, unlike early Babylon, which was known for its religious developments and law codes. The most famous Neo-Babylonian ruler was King Nebuchadnezzar II, who's mentioned in the Hebrew religious texts. The Neo-Babylonian civilization reached its peak under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II. The Neo-Babylonian Empire is a lot like the New Kingdom for ancient Egypt, and Nebuchadnezzar II is a lot like what Ramses the Great was for the Egyptians. The Babylonian civilization came to an end in 539 BCE as an independent entity, after being conquered once and for all by the Achaemenid Empire. Here's a map showing the Neo-Babylonian Empire at its greatest extent. As you can see, it's extended significantly beyond its original cultural territory in southern Mesopotamia here. It extends to the Persian Gulf, all the way into Asia Minor and Anatolia, along the eastern Mediterranean coast, and to the borders of Egypt, and then down into the Arabian Peninsula. It has completely swallowed up other civilizations, including the Hebrew civilization, which is about here. In addition to monumental architecture like ziggurats, the Babylonians also would have built gates and fortifications to protect their city. And perhaps the most famous of these gates is the Ishtar Gate of Babylon that was built roughly 575 BCE. It's made of brick, but the bricks would have been covered in a beautiful blue lapis lazuli enamel. And lapis lazuli was a semi-precious stone that was associated particularly with Mesopotamian civilizations. And the gate also was decorated with animals, particularly lions, that would have symbolized the power and might of the Babylonian culture. Visitors to Babylon would have been in awe and even a little intimidated by the beauty of this gate and the high cost it would have incurred in order to build it. Here are some images of close-ups of the Ishtar Gate and the animals mentioned previously. Here we see a lion, an important symbol of strength, particularly military strength, to the Babylonians and other Mesopotamian civilizations. We also see a bull, which symbolized strength as well, but also symbolized agricultural production. I think the most interesting animal we see here is the mythical dragon, which would have symbolized a type of spiritual power, perhaps the power of the Babylonians' religion. There's also images of plants. Some people think that these are date palms, an important food source in the ancient Near East. Here also in the center is what the Ishtar Gate looked like shortly after its excavation, before its restoration. Now we can discuss some of the mythical monumental architecture of the Neo-Babylonian civilization, specifically the Hanging Gardens. Documentary sources talk about a series of hanging gardens built by Babylonian kings, where they could have parties and have liaisons with the women in their harems. We don't, however, know where these hanging gardens would have been, or even if they were, in fact, real ziggurats, real buildings. Some archaeologists and scholars think that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have just been a simple ziggurat with date trees and plants planted on its top. Others think that these gardens may not even have been built by the Babylonians, but by another civilization, and that the Babylonians were simply taking credit for the gardens. Now we'll talk a little bit more about Nebuchadnezzar II, also known as Nebuchadnezzar the Great to the Babylonians. He was the king of the Neo-Babylonian civilization during its greatest military power and territorial extent. Naturally, he would have been a very impressive and inspiring figure to the Babylonian people. But to the civilizations that were conquered by the Babylonians, he would have been a monster, something to be feared, perhaps even a madman, as he is displayed in the Hebrew stories from the period. The Babylonians practiced the forced cultural assimilation of conquered peoples. They would move conquered peoples deeper into their empire, where they would be acculturated to Babylonian ways. This is mentioned in documentary sources from the period, including the Hebrew Bible. Nebuchadnezzar II appeared to be a successful military leader, extending the Neo-Babylonian Empire's territories, but his successors were far less successful and motivated than he was. Nebuchadnezzar extended the empire's territory and conquered surrounding civilizations, including the Hebrews of the Levant, as shown in the background of this slide, when the Babylonian forces almost destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Like Ramses the Great of Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar's descendants were not able to maintain the empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built for them on the right. We see King Balthasar, one of Nebuchadnezzar's successors, who in the Hebrew Bible was warned by God that he and the Babylonian Empire would be destroyed for their pride and for their greed and violence. The Neo-Babylonian civilization collapsed after the invasion of the Achaemenid Empire in 539 BCE. The destruction of the Neo-Babylonian civilization is attested in the Hebrew Bible, but it's also discussed by the Greek historian Herodotus as well. Now we'll discuss the Assyrian civilization, which existed during the intermediate period between the Old Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi and the Neo-Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar. The Assyrian Empire shared many cultural similarities with the Babylonians, being that they were both Mesopotamian civilizations. But the Assyrian Empire was even more warlike than the Babylonians were, and even more cruel to the people they conquered. They are a very warlike and militaristic civilization. Some of their most important leaders were Sargon II, named after the founder of the Akkadian Empire, and Sennacherib. They conquered many other civilizations in the ancient Near East and adjacent regions, including the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel. They also conquered the Egyptian civilization, as discussed in a previous video. The Assyrians, as mentioned before, were extremely harsh to conquered peoples. They practiced things that we might call ethnic cleansing, even genocide today, far more so than the Babylonians, who really wanted to make conquered peoples assimilate and become Babylonian. The Assyrians copied many elements of Babylonian art and religion, making them more warlike. The Assyrians are best remembered for their wars and their cities and palaces that they built using the spoils of the peoples they conquered. Here is a map showing the extent of the Assyrian Empire. They expanded well beyond Mesopotamia, through the Levantine region, and all the way to Egypt. Here we'll look at some Assyrian reliefs and artwork. As you can see, there's many similarities between Babylonian and Assyrian artwork and reliefs. But the Assyrians' reliefs show many more scenes of violence, military battles, and hunts against wild animals. We can get a view of the Assyrians' war chariots here, and we can show them hunting a lion with very graphic terms here. We also see that the Assyrians, like the Babylonians, and even earlier Mesopotamian civilizations like the Akkadians and the Sumerians, portray their men with rectangular beards and long hair woven into braids. The Assyrians also like to give their human subjects animal features like eagle wings. You can also see the Assyrian sculptors are putting effort and energy into making their subjects look strong and muscular and powerful. Although the reliefs of later civilizations will be more anatomically realistic. Here we can see Assyrian sculptures that feature humans with animal bodies. As I mentioned before, the Mesopotamian civilizations preferred to show deities with human heads and animal bodies, the opposite of the Egyptians. Favorite animals are lions, as well as bulls, both of which represent strength. Different kinds of strength, however. One of the reasons the Assyrians were so militarily powerful came from their early adoption of iron weapons. Here, the right-hand side of the side, you can see an Assyrian sickle sword. Iron is stronger than bronze, and it's also cheaper and easier to smelt, allowing metallurgists to make better swords, spears, and also better armor that offers more coverage, as seen here on this slide, with the Assyrian soldiers wearing scale armor that extends from their neck all the way down to their feet. Iron could also be used to make stronger siege engines, like this battering ram shown here, which would have allowed the Assyrians to more easily defeat cities that they besieged. Here are some artists' modern renditions of Assyrian warfare and combat. As you can see, the Assyrians are using iron weapons, which are much stronger and give them much better protection. They also use siege engines, and here on this slide, you see them using large chariots. As I mentioned in a previous video, chariots were both the tanks and the sports cars of the ancient Near East. Here is a look at Ashur, the Assyrian capital city. Ashur was also the name of the Assyrian god of war. You can see they were using mud bricks to build their buildings, as shown by these reconstructions made by archaeologists. You can also notice the arches as well. They're a hybrid or a transition between the corbelled arches of the ancient Mesopotamians and the proper arches that we see in later Greek and Roman architecture. As the bricks are tilted away from each other, they're not parallel with the bricks of the wall, but they're not completely in line with the edge of the arch, meaning it's a hybrid between a corbelled arch and a proper arch. Here's a reconstruction of what Ashur may have looked like in ancient times. Here's a reconstruction of what the palace of Sargon II might have looked like. Sargon II was one of the most powerful of the ancient Assyrian rulers, seen here on the left side of the slide. Notice the detail the sculptors have given to the muscles on his forearms. As you can see, Sargon's palace was heavily fortified, much like a fortress, highlighting the militarism of the ancient Assyrian society. Here's a floor plan of Sargon's palace, with temples, courts, storage rooms, etc. We can also see some of the statuary that would have decorated the palace itself and showed off Sargon's might and wealth and power. Now we'll take a look at Nineveh, which is probably the most influential Assyrian city. If Ashur was the political capital, then Nineveh was the cultural capital of the Assyrian Empire. Here we see the reliefs have been colored and painted, as the Babylonians would have done. Nowadays, the paint has long since disappeared, but you can see the action and the movement depicted in the reliefs of Nineveh. This relief shows the walls of the city, and it shows military scenes in the foreground. It also shows a river in the center, just like how the city of Nineveh had a river running through the town center. Here's a map of Nineveh with a river running through it, as I mentioned. This river would have provided water to the residents. It also could have been a form of transportation as well. The gates of the city are named after various Mesopotamian gods, including Shamash, the god of the sun and justice, and Nergal, the god of death. The city was severely damaged and almost destroyed in the year 612 BCE. Its destruction is described in contemporary written sources, like the Hebrew Bible, although some scholars and archaeologists think that the biblical story probably exaggerates the level of destruction that Nineveh experienced. But this story does reveal how much the peoples who were conquered by the Assyrians hated and detested the people who had destroyed their cities and enslaved their people. Here we'll discuss the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire grew quickly thanks to its militarism, but it made numerous enemies on its way to the top. In about the 620s BCE, the empire experienced a series of civil wars fought over who would be the next king of the Assyrian Empire. These civil wars greatly weakened the empire, leading Assyria's vassals and rivals to rise up in a coalition against Assyria. These powers, including Babylon and the Medes, dismembered Assyria over the course of about 15 years, which is really extremely fast by ancient world standards. Now we'll discuss some of the smaller but not insignificant civilizations of the ancient Near East. The first we'll talk about is the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians' most long-lasting contribution to the world's culture is the development of the first alphabet, which you can see here. The Phoenicians, rather than being militaristic like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, were primarily an economic and trade-based civilization. They were excellent seafarers and sold their goods across the Mediterranean. Because they were traders, and because they would have been keeping track of large numbers of goods and wares, they would have needed an easy-to-use writing system and an alphabet in which symbols represented sounds would be much simpler to use and learn than the notch-based cuneiform system of Mesopotamia. Here are some images of Assyrian ships. Sea-based trade was the lifeblood of the Assyrian civilization. They bought and sold goods from all across the Mediterranean and became very wealthy. They sold wood and purple dye, which you'll see on another slide, and they bought oil and wine and many other goods, and became very wealthy, even though their territorial holdings in the ancient Near East were comparatively small. Ruins of their ships, sunken ruins of their ships, can be found across the Mediterranean, like this vessel here, which was found off the coast of Spain, highlighting just how far the Assyrians had traveled. Here is a map showing how far the ancient Phoenicians traveled on their trade missions. They sold dye made from seashells so that clothing and other textiles could be dyed this purplish red color. This dye was very expensive, and purple quickly became a royal color, worn by kings and members of the elite classes who could afford the expensive dye sold by the Phoenicians. We'll talk more about the Phoenicians, specifically their city of Carthage, in a later video. Another smaller but very influential civilization we'll talk about from the ancient Near East was the Hebrew civilization. The Hebrews, also known as the Israelites, were best known for their monotheistic spiritual beliefs, which would inspire the creation of multiple religions still practiced today, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Here on this slide, you can see some of the ways in which the ancient Hebrew people worshipped their God, whom we think they called Yahweh. They worshipped their God in a tent called a tabernacle, shown here, when the Hebrew people were nomadic, which they were for a good portion of their history. After the Hebrew people settled down in the Levantine region, they built a temple to their God, shown here. The temple presumably was destroyed by the Babylonians when the Babylonian Empire took over the last of the Hebrew civilization about 586 to 585 BCE. The Hebrews also left extensive written records about their spiritual and religious beliefs and how they evolved over time, as seen in the Dead Sea Scrolls of Qumran, which were discovered in the 1940s and 1950s of the Common Era. These scrolls form the basis and the original sources for the modern Hebrew Bible, known as the Tanakh, as well as many Christian religious written texts as well. Now we'll discuss some archaeological evidence relating to the Hebrew Israelite civilization. One of the most important historical figures for the Israelite or Hebrew people was King David. And King David was a warrior king of the Hebrew people, and he ruled the Israelites about the year 1000 BC. And according to the biblical sources, the Jewish and Christian religious texts, he was the one that captured Jerusalem and gave it to the Israelite Hebrew people. The image on the left-hand side of this slide is actually a medieval era statue of David held in the Met NYC. It's not from ancient times, but it is an interesting piece. And for many years, scholars thought that David was primarily a mythic or spiritual figure developed by later Jewish people, sort of as a mythic type figure, like a Paul Bunyan, for example, for their culture, for their people. But there are some pieces of archaeological evidence to suggest that King David was in fact a real historical figure. And probably the best piece of archaeological evidence is called the Tel Dan inscription, and it's from about the 900s to 800s BCE, so 1 to 200 years after King David would have lived. So not very long after his life, not enough time for him to really develop into a mythic figure, but this piece mentions a victory over the house of David, a reference to the Israelites. That David was associated with the Israelites really only a century or so after when he would have lived. And I think that's some pretty good archaeological evidence that King David was, in fact, a real person. Also, this epigraph, this inscription is from the Aramean people, but it's actually written when the Phoenician alphabet. The Arameans would have spoken Aramaic, but they're using the Phoenician alphabet, which attests to the popularity of the Phoenician script, the Phoenician alphabet. And you can see the Tel Dan inscription in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Another interesting thing to know about the Tel Dan inscription is it suggests that the Hebrew civilization was divided into two separate kingdoms at this point, which you see in the religious text, that is the Jewish Tanakh and the Christian Old Testament. It describes the kingdom of Israel, basically built by King David, is then divided into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel was taken over and basically destroyed by the Assyrians, and Judah survived for a little bit longer and then was basically destroyed by the Babylonians, with a lot of the Jewish people from Judah being taken to Babylon. Also, another very interesting piece that shows a connection between the people of Israel and the Greeks is a Corinthian helmet that was found in the waters off Haifa. It's held by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and as you can see from the slide, it's a Corinthian-style helmet. It's of the older style, but it does have some very interesting carvings. There are engravings of peacock feathers on the forehead of the helmet, so it's a very interesting piece. This helmet would have belonged to a wealthy Greek person, possibly a Greek mercenary that was fighting in the Middle East, and certainly a Greek mercenary in that part of the Middle East would have been aware of the kingdom of Israel. The last of the smaller but not insignificant civilizations that we'll talk about before we move on to our discussion of the Persians are the Hittites, or the Hittite civilization. And the Hittite civilization lasted from about 1650 to 1190 BCE or so in Anatolia. Although elements of Hittite culture will exist after the 1190s. At the Hittite civilization's greatest territorial extent, they controlled territory south down into the Levantine region, as well as the island of Cyprus as well. And the Hittite culture is very interesting because it's a mix of many different regional cultures. There's elements of Mesopotamian culture, but there's also elements of Canaanite culture and Indo-European culture as well. The Hittites spoke a language that was derived from Proto-Indo-European, PIE or Pi for short. They probably actually called their language Nesili, but they actually wrote their language using cuneiform, a Mesopotamian script, which is very interesting. It highlights just the mixture of cultures within Hittite society. And the capital city of the Hittite civilization and their most important city would have been Hattusa. And the Hittites actually called themselves the Hattusa, we think. Hittite culture was very militaristic. They were very skilled equestrian warriors, especially when it came to chariots. We think they made some very important developments in the sort of chariot engineering, particularly when it came to axles, which would have allowed their chariots to be a lot faster and more stable than those being used by their enemies, which makes sense because Indo-European cultures were equestrian cultures. They were very skilled with chariot making. Many scholars think that Indo-European people in what is now either southern Russia or Kazakhstan, about the 2000s, that they probably invented the first two-wheeled chariots. Before the 2000s, wheeled vehicles usually had two axles with four wheels, more like a wagon than a two-wheeled chariot. And of course, a two-wheeled chariot is a lot faster and more maneuverable. A chariot will also have what are called spoke wheels. Instead of solid wheels that are just a block of wood attached to an axle, spoke wheels are more like a bicycle or wagon wheel. And they're much lighter, which allows a chariot with spoke wheels to go much faster than a wagon with solid wheels. So the Hittites, following sort of the Indo-European tradition, are very skilled charioteers. They also were a Bronze Age civilization, but it appears they had some iron weapons as well, although they usually made their iron weapons using meteoric iron. We don't think nowadays that they had mastered iron smelting. And meteoric iron basically is iron deposits, pure iron that falls to the earth in meteors that can then be worked into weapons and things of this nature. Iron smelting, however, is taking iron ore and purifying it at very, very high temperatures to then make iron weapons. And that's a much more sophisticated process, but it allows you to make a lot more iron weapons than if you're just using meteoric iron. So we can give the Hittite people a lot of points for their chariot technology, but they were not really able to develop iron weapons on a very large scale, which is going to be a problem for them. And some famous leaders of the Hittite civilization are people like King Muwatalli II. He was the commander of the Hittite forces who fought Ramses II at the Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BCE. The Battle of Kadesh took place down here. Basically, they were bumping up against Egyptian territory in the Middle East, and of course the Egyptians were sort of bumping up against Hittite territory. And the Hittites are rivals of the Egyptians. They're going to be rivals of the Hebrews. They're going to be rivals of other Middle Eastern civilizations. And there's also good evidence that they came into contact with the Bronze Age Greeks, or commonly known as the Mycenaean Greeks. And they probably called the Bronze Age Greeks something like the Ahia or the Ahiyawa. And that's where we think the term Achaia comes from, or this was how the Hittites called Achaia or Achaeans. They called them Ahia. Their major monumental architecture are these spectacular dry stone ramparts and walls and fortifications. They also have some very interesting temples as well. They're made of stone. We'll look at some examples on the next slide. I would argue that their material culture, though, becomes more Mesopotamian with time. This is probably because as the Hittite civilization gets weaker and weaker, there's more of a Mesopotamian influence coming in from the south and east. And ultimately, the Hittite civilization will fall apart during what is called the Bronze Age collapse, in which a lot of civilizations in the Middle East and in the Aegean region, like the Mycenaean Greeks, those civilizations will fall apart as other civilizations, particularly civilizations that really master iron weapons, basically destroy these older Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittites were not regular iron users. They used a little bit of iron, but not a lot of iron. And it appears that the Assyrians, who had mastered the use of iron, basically came in and destroyed much of the Hittite civilization. And then another group of people, a maritime culture called the Sea Peoples, basically came in from the west. And basically they were attacked by the west, by the Sea Peoples, by the east, by the Assyrians, and that led to the dissolution of the Hittite civilization. Although there are some elements of Hittite culture that will remain even after the civilization itself collapses. Here's some examples of Hittite architecture. As you can see, they're doing a lot with various types of stone, particularly dry stone work. It makes sense that they're using a lot of stone. They're in Anatolia. It's a very mountainous, rocky region. So you use the materials you have access to. This is how civilizations are built. They adapt to their environment. And the Hittites were adapting to the rocky Anatolian environment by using a lot of stone. And stone is a great building material. It lasts a long time. It's much better than wood or mud brick. So it leaves a lot of material evidence for archaeologists to study. What's also interesting about the Hittite dry stone fortifications is they're very similar to, or they will remind people of Mycenaean Greek fortifications, the dry stone fortifications that the Mycenaean Greeks built in their citadels. Particularly when you look at these gates. This is a lion gate from about the 14th century BCE. It's at Hattusa. Actually, all of the slides here are from Hattusa, their capital, their most important city. And they look a lot like what the Mycenaean Greeks were building at about the same point in their history. And it could also be just because Greece is very rocky, very mountainous. The Greeks are building things with stone. It could also be the shared Indo-European heritage between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites. Both civilizations were impacted by the Indo-European migrations. It's very interesting to sort of see this cultural similarity between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites. So a couple of other examples. This is the Hattusa Rampart. This was probably built a little bit earlier. It's basically fortifications around Hattusa. They're protecting their cities, just like the Mycenaean Greeks did, just like Mesopotamian civilizations did. Fortifications were very important. The ancient Greek playwright Aristophanes, who lived centuries after the Hittites, he once said, "It is from their foes, not their friends, that cities learn the lesson of building high walls." And the Hittites built high walls, and it helped keep their civilization alive for a while, but not for forever. They were eventually going to be defeated by other civilizations. And this is the foundation of the Hittite Great Temple, where they would have worshipped their gods. The Hittites were a polytheistic civilization, meaning they had a pantheon of many gods. Their gods seem to be a mix of traditions from Canaan and from Mesopotamia, but also from the Indo-European cultures as well. So once again, the Hittites are a mix of cultures. There's a lot of cultural syncretism going on in the Hittite civilization. Here are some more examples of Hittite material culture. This is a sphinx. It has a very Egyptian style, in my opinion, particularly the headdress of this figurine. Over here we have a drinking vessel, a cup of some kind shaped like a fist. And the way this cup is shaped and some of the engraving work higher up on the wrist has a very, what I would say is a very Indo-European style. You see this kind of metalwork amongst other Indo-European derived cultures. It really reminds me of some things that the Celts were making centuries and centuries later. Once again, I think highlighting some of the Indo-European elements in the Hittite culture. This here is a close-up of a Hittite king or possibly Hittite god of war. It's actually from the gate that we looked at on the previous slide. This is a restored version of what the original piece would have looked like. The relief is sort of reminiscent of some Mesopotamian style reliefs, but the artwork's a little bit different. The figure is not as well muscled as you might see in the Mesopotamian reliefs. His muscular proportions are a little bit more, I would say, realistic, a little bit more gracile. It looks a bit more Egyptian to me. But there are elements that are sort of unique to the Hittite culture. This sort of long kind of aquiline nose. A lot of Hittite reliefs and artwork feature people with sort of these kind of long noses. It seems that's how the Hittites chose to mark themselves out. Also, the figure does not have a beard. He appears to be clean-shaven. That seems to have been a style amongst the Hittites. Unlike other Mesopotamian civilizations preferred men with beards, the Hittites preferred that their men not have beards, perhaps more like the Egyptians, or even like the Mycenaean Greeks, who typically did not wear beards. You can see this figure's clutching an axe of some kind, and he's wearing a helmet as well. And this helmet has what appear to be some type of horns. And horn helmets are used by many different cultures around the world. They're not very practical in battle, but they can look very intimidating. And a lot of Indo-European cultures like to use horned helmets. So once again, a possible Indo-European influence in Hittite culture. It's a civilization that's borrowing elements from a variety of cultures. And then the last image on this slide is a sort of a chimera, and this is definitely very Mesopotamian influenced. You see this kind of artwork in Mesopotamia. And it's from the post-Hittite period, where there's still kind of pockets of Hittite culture, but the Hittite civilization as a political power has come to an end, and it's much more Mesopotamian looking, as I said, reflecting how the Assyrians, a Mesopotamian culture, have come in and defeated the Hittite civilization. The Hittites, as I mentioned before, were proficient charioteers. They developed some very important chariot technology, particularly when it came to axles. We think that they basically took the axles of their chariots and moved the axle forward towards the horses and away from the back of the chariot, which allowed the chariot to be a lot more stable. And this innovation would have allowed the Hittites to really be able to go toe-to-toe with the Egyptians, like at the Battle of Kadesh. The Battle of Kadesh was fought sort of at the frontier of Hittite and Egyptian civilizations, basically where these two civilizations came together. And the battle itself was inconclusive. But ancient civilizations, they always would claim victory when they got home to their capital cities. But now that we've discussed some of the smaller, less well-known civilizations of the ancient Near East, now we'll talk about the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire. And I would argue that of all of the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, they're going to be the greatest, most significant rivals of the Greeks. Now we'll discuss the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid Empire, which lasted from about 550 to 330 BCE, was larger than any previous empire in world history. Also known as the Persian Empire, since the Persians were the ruling class of the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid Empire spread over 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, reaching India in the east, the Balkans in Europe in the northwest, and then Egypt in the southwest. The Achaemenid Empire was multi-ethnic and multiracial. It included Near Easterners, Asians, Europeans, and Africans. The empire was also more multicultural and tolerant than other empires, civilizations that have been discussed previously. The Achaemenids allowed conquered peoples to practice their religion and culture as long as they paid their taxes and supplied warriors to the Achaemenid army via the satrap system. There were, of course, some exceptions to this trend, especially in places like Egypt, which frequently rebelled against the Achaemenid Empire. Some famous Achaemenid rulers included Cyrus the Great and Darius the First. We'll also discuss the art and culture and architecture of the Achaemenid Empire as well. Here's the Achaemenid Empire at its greatest extent, which it reached under the rule of Darius the First. As you can see, it spreads as far east as India, and it spreads into Europe as well, north of Greece. It also extends south, down through Egypt and Libya and North Africa. It also occupies Mesopotamia and the territories of the old Assyrian and Babylonian empires, as well as the Phoenician and Hebrew civilizations. Let's briefly talk about the origins of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persians, the ruling class of the Achaemenid Empire, were originally confederations of semi-nomadic tribes from the Zagros Mountains in what is now Iran. They conquered the more sedentary Median Empire in the region about 550 BCE. Then they had turned their attention to the west. They conquered Mesopotamia and the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 539 BCE, along with the Lydian Empire of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and then Egypt by 525 BCE. The Achaemenids fielded large multi-ethnic armies. Units called immortals were the dominant force in the Achaemenid army. They earned this name, the Immortals, because they always kept at least 10,000 effective troops on the ground, leading their enemies to suggest that the Persian troops were immortal because they just never seemed to run out of soldiers. The Achaemenids fought the Greek city-states for over half a century, from about 499 to 449 BCE, but they failed to conquer all of the Greek city-states, at least in Greece. They did conquer some of the Greek colonies in Anatolia and what is now Turkey. Here are some modern recreations of Persian soldiers in the Persian Immortal Army. The Persians liked bright patterned clothing, unlike other civilizations like the Egyptians, as shown in these images. The Immortals also used a variety of weapons and armor, reflecting the multi-ethnic and even multicultural nature of the Achaemenid Empire. They used a variety of weapons made from a variety of materials, including both iron and bronze. Their colors were anything but drab, as they have been portrayed in certain recent films. The Persians, the ruling class of the Achaemenid Empire, spoke a Proto-Indo-European language. Yet, when they built the Achaemenid Empire, they adopted the millennia-old cuneiform script, probably because it would have been familiar to their conquered subjects, especially the Babylonians. The decision to adopt cuneiform reflected the Achaemenid Empire's diversity and pluralism, as they used elements and cultural mores from the peoples that they conquered. Now we'll take a look at some Achaemenid Persian art, specifically their reliefs. Like the Babylonians, the Persians really liked to make reliefs. That was a very important type of artwork for the Persians. And you could definitely see a Mesopotamian influence in the style of the figures of these reliefs. But there are some differences as well. I think Persian reliefs are a bit more sophisticated. I think the people, as they're represented in Persian reliefs, look a bit more realistic, a bit more anatomically realistic. They're not quite as stylized as like earlier Babylonian reliefs. Other differences are typically Persians are represented with shorter hair and shorter beards than is shown in like Assyrian or Babylonian reliefs. This could be just differences in fashion between the Persians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. But you often see, though, that Persian kings are represented with longer hair and beards. Perhaps in the Persian society, very long beards were reserved for kings, perhaps to indicate the king's social status, that he was above other people. The Persians often referred to their kings as the king of the world. The idea that not only is he the king of the Persian people, but he's the king of everybody. So they would have wanted to do anything they could to make their kings as grand as possible. Another difference between Persian reliefs and some of the older Mesopotamian reliefs are some of the headdresses or hats being worn by Persian people, particularly what is called the Phrygian cap. The Phrygian cap actually is worn by a variety of Indo-Iranic cultures. Basically, the Indo-European cultures, they went down into Europe, they went down into Anatolia, but they also went into what is now Iran, and the Persian culture was impacted by the arrival of Indo-European people. And other Indo-European cultures, or Indo-Iranic cultures, basically the Indo-Europeans that went eastward down into Iran and sort of in Central Asia, like, for example, the Scythians, who were a nomadic equestrian culture. They really liked this Phrygian cap, as it was called. And you see this in a lot of Indo-Iranic cultures. Eventually, though, other cultures will start wearing the Phrygian cap. Even the Greeks will wear a version of the Phrygian cap, although they'll wear it actually more like a helmet. Instead of making it out of cloth, it'll be made out of metal. So there are some similarities between Persian reliefs and Babylonian reliefs and Assyrian reliefs, but there's some also important differences as well. Persian relief art is also a testament to the multicultural, multi-ethnic, and indeed multiracial nature of Persian society. Reliefs show people of different types wearing different kinds of ethnic garb. The image on the top left of this slide is from the tomb of Xerxes in the 400s or so BCE, and someone has attempted to identify the ethnicity of the various figures being portrayed. Also, these reliefs would have been painted. The pigments have faded with time, but they may have painted their subjects with different skin tones to reflect the multi-ethnic and multiracial populace of the empire. As you can see in this painted version of a relief from Persepolis, which shows people of varying skin tones. Interestingly, the Achaemenids, they depicted their arch rivals, the Greeks, in surprisingly nuanced ways. The Greeks were their enemies, but they also recognized that there were ethnic Greek people in the Persian armies who either fought as mercenaries or who were conscripts, basically Greek provinces in Ionia. These areas would have been required to provide the Persian Empire with soldiers as part of being in the Persian Empire. This figure here is wearing a tunic and a wide-brimmed Patazos hat. The Patazos hat was a very Greek style of wide-brimmed hat. Some of the other standout figures in this relief are a soldier from the Indian subcontinent and a what appears to be an Ethiopian or sub-Saharan African soldier. Also, there appears to be an Egyptian soldier as well. You can see these figures have different clothing styles, different types of facial hair, different hair textures, hairstyles. It really shows the multiculturalism of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This was an empire that extended across 3 continents. They had territorial holdings in Africa, territorial holdings in Europe, and then territorial holdings across Asia and the Middle East. But just because the Persian Empire was multi-ethnic does not mean it was a paradise where everyone got along. And in many cases, these peoples that are in the Persian Empire, they don't want to be in the empire, and they'll often rebel. The Ionian people will rebel against the Persians. The Egyptians will rebel against the Persians. So it certainly was not a utopia. Here are some images of Atossa, the famous Achaemenid queen. Atossa was the daughter of Cyrus the Great. She later married Darius the First. Bust of her likeness can be seen at the right-hand side of this slide. An artist recreation of what she may have looked like based on the bust can be seen at left. Although she lived in the 500s BCE, Tosa's bust bears many similarities to the Inanna mask from over 2,500 years earlier, seen in the center. You notice some of the similarities in the forehead and eyes. Here is Cyrus the Great, the Achaemenid warrior king. Cyrus lived from about 600 to 530 BCE. 70 years, a good long life by ancient world standards. The evidence suggests that Cyrus was healthy and physically strong, being a hunter and a warrior. Cyrus, through his military exploits, the conquest of the Medes and the Babylonians especially, gave the Persian people the Achaemenid Empire. Although he was very militaristic and conquered many people groups, Cyrus himself was fairly pluralistic. He allowed conquered peoples to maintain their cultural and spiritual beliefs so long as they remained obedient to the empire. Cyrus was militaristic, as I mentioned before, and he died in battle fighting a people group called the Massagetai. The Massagetai were a nomadic people of the Eurasian steppe. Cyrus was buried in a tomb at the city of Pasargadae. You can see his tomb at left. It's reminiscent of a miniature ziggurat. On the whole, Cyrus is considered to be one of the best Achaemenid kings for his military exploits and the pluralism and magnanimity he showed to the people he conquered. He's celebrated by some of the people he conquered, including the Hebrews. Another very important Achaemenid king was Darius I, who ruled from 522 to 486 BCE. There was one king between Darius and Cyrus, named Cambyses, who was not considered to be a good king. Darius was known more for his administrative rule rather than his military exploits, which were less successful than those of Cyrus. Darius is also known for beginning the wars against the Greek city-states, probably his biggest mistake. Darius kept the pluralistic traditions of the Achaemenid Empire going, although there were some exceptions during the Babylonian, Egyptian, and Ionian revolts. Darius also oversaw the construction of roads and infrastructure, and even a postal service, so that he could better communicate with his satraps in other parts of the empire. Like Cyrus, he's also considered to be one of the best of the Achaemenid rulers, even if he did make some mistakes. Now we'll talk a little bit about the Achaemenids' religion, Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was the official religion of the Achaemenid Empire. Other religions, including Egyptian and Mesopotamian polytheism, and Judaism were followed by certain conquered peoples as well. But they were allowed to observe their religion so long as they remained subservient to the empire. Zoroastrianism is based on the teachings of Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, pictured here. Zoroastrianism, as a religion, stresses the battle between cosmic good, Ahura Mazda, and cosmic evil, Angra Mainyu. Zoroastrians constructed fire temples, shown here, where they commemorated the flames, which were and are seen as holy. Zoroastrianism may have influenced other religions, including both Buddhism and Christianity, and Zoroastrianism is still practiced today in parts of Asia and the Near East. By the way, this is a very simple discussion of the religious beliefs of the Zoroastrianisms, so far as they are relevant to the Achaemenid Empire. I've obviously had to simplify these things, and I mean no respect to anyone who might be following this religion. On the left part of this slide is a depiction of Ahura Mazda, who represents the cosmic good. On the right is Angra Mainyu, represented as a monster. Good and evil must vie against each other in an eternal struggle, a according to Zoroastrianism. As a religion, Zoroastrianism teaches that earth, fire, and water, the fundamental elements, are holy, and they must not be polluted by burial or decomposition. As such, Achaemenids, who followed Zoroastrianism, practiced unique burial rites involving towers of silence. Towers of silence essentially were open-air charnel houses in which the bodies of the newly deceased would be placed. These bodies would be left to decompose in the open air, and carrion birds like vultures would eat the flesh of the dead until only the bones remained. The bones, denuded of their flesh, would then be placed in the central well here after they decomposed along the edges of the tower. Over time, the bones in the central well would break down, and in this way, Zoroastrians don't have to bury the bodies of the dead or cremate them as other cultures did, nor do they have to mummify them the way the Egyptians did. Let's talk about the architecture of some of the Achaemenid cities, because the architecture of these cities reflects the pluralism of their culture. First, we'll talk about Persepolis, which was the Achaemenid imperial capital and ceremonial complex. It was really a large collection of palaces and not a city in the sense of Child's definition. But the architecture is very interesting, and it's emblematic of the values of the Achaemenid Empire. In this slide, we can see multiple architectural styles being used simultaneously. We see stonework that's reminiscent of ancient Egyptian architecture, as you can see with the pediments here at the top of these portals. Portal is, of course, a fancy term for a doorway. We can also see these columns here. These lines, called fluting, were very important in Greek architecture. As I mentioned, there were Greek people who were conquered in parts of Anatolia. And it's possible the Persians may have learned how to build columns like this there. Here's some more views of Persepolis' architecture. The capitals of these columns are very reminiscent of the capitals of Egyptian columns. They look a lot like papyrus. We can also see Mesopotamian-style statues with human heads placed on animal bodies. Here is a plan of Persepolis. As you can see, it's multiple palaces guarded with a wall, similar to the Assyrian palaces, which were also guarded with walls. Here's its location in what is now present-day Iran. While Persepolis may have been the spiritual and ceremonial capital of the Persian civilization, the de facto capital was Susa. And Susa was the de facto capital for many reasons. One of the most important reasons was its idyllic location. It fits with the prime rule of real estate: location, location, location. And the area around Susa had been settled for possibly thousands of years before the Persians set up shop in the area. Some people think that the settlement may date back as far as 4400 BCE. Certainly there's buildings that are centuries older than the Persian civilization, like this ziggurat here, which is about 30 kilometers away from Susa itself. And this ziggurat's from the 1250s BCE, attesting to the long-term use of Susa and the nearby areas. And the stratigraphy at the site, that is the layers of strata of human occupation, they could be described as tells. Basically, as they break down, they form basically hill-like structures, which then can be excavated by archaeologists. and it's the perfect location for a city. There's abundant water sources from rivers and from springs. It's on a plain, very flat ground, allowing for very easy agriculture. But there's mountains nearby, the Zagros Mountains, which would provide opportunities for mining. A civilization like the Persians are going to need access to mineral resources to build their empire. So they've got everything they need to really build a large civilization in and around Susa. And as such, it will basically be the legal capital, or not the legal capital, but the business and administrative capital of the Persian Empire. As you can see by the palace of King Darius that was built at Susa. Here are some of the features of the city of Susa. There's a lot of nearby sources of water, including springs, which would have supported lush gardens and rich agricultural fields for the people of Susa. There also would have been numerous examples of monumental architecture in the city, especially things like the Palace of Darius. This is a artist's rendition of what the city of Susa may have looked like in its prime. And this is an image showing archaeological investigation of the Susa site. And you can see the many different layers of occupation at the Susa site. And you'll also notice that there is a similarity in the architectural style of the buildings at Susa with the kind of buildings built by the older Mesopotamian civilization. These Persian palaces look sort of ziggurat-like in appearance, highlighting the cultural continuity between these ancient Near Eastern civilizations. Conclusion. Once again, we've covered a lot of ground in this video, well over a millennia of time and multiple civilizations. What I hoped you saw, though, was that there's great diversity amongst the civilizations that inhabited the ancient Near East, from the militaristic Assyrians to the more pluralistic Achaemenids. There was major cultural syncretism and sharing of cultural traditions, even within this diversity, though. For example, many of the civilizations adopted cuneiform, or the Phoenician alphabet. These civilizations also built monumental architecture and created artwork reminiscent of the old Mesopotamian civilizations, but they made their own unique advancements and modifications. These civilizations shared spiritual and religious ideas, but they also developed new religions as well, like Zoroastrianism. Warfare, especially with the introduction of iron weapons, could allow a civilization to rapidly increase its territorial holdings. But war could be its undoing as well. You might say that war could be a double-edged sword. Because of their wars, the Assyrians made too many enemies, leading to their destruction. The Babylonians, because of their wars, could not maintain their expanded empire. And the Persians' failed conflict with the Greeks turned this far-off, seemingly isolated European people into an extremely dangerous adversary that would ultimately destroy the Persian Empire in the end. But we'll talk more about that in a future video.